Welcome to Data for Future, the podcast where we explore the synergy between data and sustainability. Do you know that over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from just 100 companies? Understanding and managing carbon footprint is more important than ever, and that's where carbon accounting comes in. Carbon accounting helps businesses and governments to identify emission sources, find the most effective way to reduce emission, and then provide the transparency needed to hold them accountable and make real progress. Today, we're diving into carbon accounting with our guest, Prakhar Agarwal, a product manager at Carbon Direct and a passionate advocate for using technology and data to tackle climate challenges. We'll discuss about what carbon accounting is, the progress being made so far, the challenges that remains, and then the role of AI in building better solutions in the product space. We'll also hear about Prakhar's journey into climate tech, along with advices and tips for those aspiring to do the same. Welcome to the show, Prakhar.
Thank you for having me, Tammy. It's great to be here.
To set the baseline, can you use a story or example to illustrate what is carbon accounting?
Yeah, carbon accounting is the practice of measuring carbon emissions in simple words. And what that means generally is more of in a corporate context where companies are looking to measure their carbon emissions based on the activities that they are having, whether it's transportation, employee commuting, employee travel, or the supply chain, things of that nature. And if you take a consumer lens to it, it's basically understanding the carbon footprint of my life, the products that I'm buying, how much emissions goes into producing that product. And that includes things like actual production and also transportation and consumption of those materials. And generally, when we talk about carbon accounting, we focus more on the companies because that's where the carbon accounting is taken into account as similar to financial accounting. So those two things go hand in hand. And that's why we focus more of carbon accounting practice on the companies. Now, when it comes to what it entails, from a company's perspective, there are three different scopes: scope one, scope two, scope three. Scope one is effectively all the emissions that a company is emitting as part of their vehicles, the fuels that they burn. So anything that is under their control directly, that's scope one. Scope two is mainly about the emissions that they have generated from things that they have purchased, like electricity, the fuel they have purchased. So when you have a utility that's supplying you gas or electricity, that's called scope two. Scope three, which is a very big chunk of emissions for a company, is mainly about the production of materials, transportation, and logistics and supply chain. So all of that combines into scope three. And that's where generally we see companies having more than 70, 80% of their emissions because that chunk is just so big.
You actually compared carbon accounting to general financial accounting of a company.
Mhm.
However, we all know that the maturity level is not there yet. So, what is the current status of carbon accounting in companies nowadays? And what are some progress and challenges in the space?
I believe a lot of progress has been made on this. However, carbon accounting itself as a concept has been around for like 20, 25 years, but it was purely academic from the early stages. And over the course of these decades, things have improved significantly to help companies measure their emissions. And it has gone from using spreadsheets to using some sophisticated platforms where you can put in your data and get the emissions done. The progress is great. However, the challenge really is still in terms of data collection and in terms of measuring the emissions from that data. And what that means is that we have situation where a company, let's call it maybe like a 500 employee company, they have different functions and they have third-party suppliers and they are getting utility from their providers. All of those data sets are spread out. So it's a very fragmented data situation. And as a result of that, anybody who's responsible in the company to measure the emissions, they have a very hard time doing the data collection and then measuring the emissions from that because they are not suitable for doing all that work. They don't have the tools, they don't have the expertise for doing that. That's where I think the challenge still lies. It's helpful to see new platforms helping organize the work of doing carbon footprinting and carbon accounting. But in general, the work is still done manually. And there
Mhm.
is a huge opportunity for us to go and build solutions that would automate a lot of these things. Because as you mentioned in the starting, that 70% of the emissions are coming from 100 companies. The interesting bit is also that 50% of worldwide emissions are coming from small size companies. And those small size companies represent about 90% plus of our businesses worldwide. So when you have a situation like this where um, you have some tools, but those tools are only affordable and usable by larger companies, and you're
Mhm.
pricing out basically all the smaller companies, which represent 90% of the worldwide population in terms of companies, then those companies are not able to do this. And that's where the challenge really lies. You want to be able to build solutions for these companies that can adopt these, and adoption means good price and good scalability and solving the data collection problem really well. So those are the kind of things where I think more progress needs to be made. And that's where the real opportunity lies. And now we have AI which can help with some of these things. And we can talk more about that.
Sure. So the challenge has always lie on the data collection part, and now we are able to do it better, but then the price comes in as a concern, especially for small, medium-sized enterprise who want to do well and measure well their carbon accounting. But I guess this level of complexity, echoing back what you introduced as the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, they vary, right, for each company. Maybe within scope 1 and 2 is relatively easier, but scope 3 is very much more complex. Can you
Mhm.
shed more light on that?
Yes. So as I mentioned, scope three accounts for generally like 70, 80% of a company's emissions. And it varies a whole lot across industries, across company sizes. Because let's say you are a law firm versus let's say you are a cement manufacturing plant. So those are two very different companies. And
Mhm.
in case of a law firm, for example, majority of their scope three emissions would be coming from employee travel, commuting, and buying some services and products. They don't have anything that they're manufacturing. So they don't have a supply chain per se. Now, when it comes to, let's say, a cement manufacturing company, they are producing things based on the material that they're buying from their suppliers. And then their products, their cement they're producing, it's actually going to be used by the distributors, sold by distributors. All of that requires transportation. So this, these two different companies represent the complexity that is in the scope 3 world and therefore in the carbon accounting world. And that's where the whole issue of standardization comes in because we have
Mhm.
some standards where things like greenhouse gas protocol and ISO, they help in defining these standards, but the interpretation of those standards is different by people who are doing carbon accounting for different industries and different size companies.
Yeah, as in financial accounting, we have currency as a standard, but
Yes.
when we come to carbon accounting, we don't have it yet. For example, like 1 ton of steel produced in Australia versus in India, let's say, could have very different connotations in terms of carbon footprint. And currently, are we creating better solutions for that or just introducing more standards?
There are two things that are happening. One is that we have, like, we talked about dollar and currencies as being the standard for financial accounting. For carbon accounting, there is this concept of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. And
Mhm.
that is a unit that is being used to measure the carbon emissions for each activity that goes on into a company. That is calculated based on a certain quantity of material or process, and it's applied against an emission factor. Emission factor is basically saying if you spend $10 on this activity, you should be using this emission factor to multiply that with that emission factor and that quantity to get the kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent. What's happening is these emission factors are very variable across industries, across countries. So there is a different definition for these emission factors across different countries. And as a result of that, you don't have a standard that's coming along. There's work being done now to say we are going to use, let's say, US has a set of emission factors, UK has one, EU has one. So what happens right now is all these solution providers, they are serving clients across the world, and they're
Mhm.
using the local emission factors for the country in which that company is. And now there is progress being made to build a list of international emission factors. So that's a very, very important progress, and I'm really happy about it. The second thing that's happening is so far we have had a new framework or a new reporting standard. And when I say reporting standard, what it means is companies that are doing carbon accounting, that are measuring their emissions, they're required to disclose their emissions to their investors, to regulatory bodies, and submit annual sustainability reports. And to do
Mhm.
that, they have to generate these reports. These reports need to meet some standards. Those standards so far have been same way as emission factors. They are localized based on a country or based on a continent. But now we are seeing an international standard taking shape, which would be a combination of bunch of these so that we don't have to have companies trying to figure out which standard they need to meet. We don't have to have solution providers trying to meet all those standards for their customers. So those two things are happening as we speak. And there is one organization called Carbon Accounting Alliance, which is basically a group of carbon accounting people around the world who are coming together to help with these definitions, to help with software interoperability. And all these things are going to come around and say, okay, we were in a world where financial accounting was pretty established. Carbon accounting was getting definition. And as a result of all these functions, all these people, all these groups, we have reached a stage where carbon accounting is standardized. So that world
Mhm.
is going to come along.
Yeah. Sure. So not only from the collection part is the main challenge, then aligning the standard and know how to report properly is also a challenge that enterprises who want to do or who are required to do carbon accounting are facing. You briefly mentioned there is exciting development in terms of how AI and data is used in the carbon accounting space. Can you give us some example of how AI and data is tackling these challenges we just mentioned?
Yes, this is very interesting. I recently read something about AI development and how people are using and building AI applications. One of the things that I realized was that back in 2007, 2008, when cloud computing was just getting started, till that point, everybody had their own private servers, their private infrastructure, and they would host their applications on it. Big companies would have it, small companies would have it. What happened with cloud computing was that it started replacing that infrastructure. And as a result of that, the applications that were built on the physical infrastructure had to be ported over. Eventually, applications were built only for cloud. They were not even built for the physical infrastructure. And that's an evolution that I have seen in cloud computing world. I believe I've seen now similar things happening in the AI world because we are looking at all these AI models is ChatGPT, Claude, Mistral, and Llama from Meta, and a bunch of others. All these are getting really smart and they are obviously still hosted on the cloud. But if you look at it from an application perspective, these models are getting smart and they're becoming the critical infrastructure on which bunch of applications are being built. So in the last couple of years, you have seen a lot of these applications that have come along and they're based on some of these models. So these applications now are being very use case specific. There are applications for managing your Zoom recordings. There are applications for managing your meeting notes, scheduling emails, scheduling meetings, all the fun stuff. And there are applications for business to business as well. So I believe that all of these startups that are building these AI applications are going to be in a situation where some of these use cases are going to become critical for the underlying model itself. because we have seen examples of startups building the applications for parsing some data from a PDF. And then that functionality came along in the model itself. So as we see that progress on the model and the applications, I believe carbon accounting will go through some of that similar situation. We have seen so far a lot of applications and platforms that do a great job of helping organize the task of doing carbon accounting, but it's still manual and it still is stuck on data collection land. It still requires manually reviewing the data to calculate the emissions. So we want to be in a situation where um, we are taking a leapfrog with the solutions that AI can offer and say, these are good applications, but we want to be able to really go and build some solutions that can do the task in an automated fashion. Go and fetch my data automatically, go and do my calculations automatically. Let me just be the reviewer instead of the doer of the work. So that is the progress that I believe we will see with AI in carbon accounting. And I believe also that this concept of AI agents is going to play a huge role in terms of sitting at the source of the data and not even having to move data from A to B. Just do the calculations at the source itself and then compile all the results into one single place and publish the report, all of that automatically. It's possible, totally possible.
I believe whoever is doing carbon accounting in their company right now, listen to this, they want it to happen instantly. So how is
Yeah.
the situation in the market now? Like if I type carbon accounting and search it, there are hundreds of companies that just pop up and every company seems unique, offering similar but slightly different services.
Yeah.
So you being a product manager in this very competitive market, introduce us more of your experience at Carbon Direct.
Yes. So Carbon Direct's history is more into carbon removals. That's how the company started, like setting up projects, working with project developers to make sure there are high quality carbon removal credits that they can then sell to companies. What we realized in the process was that companies don't know how much they need to buy. So there is a lack of a emissions baseline for them to understand how much impact their purchases of credits is going to drive, which basically meant carbon accounting was important for their carbon management journey. And because of that, the company decided to invest in building a carbon accounting solution. Obviously, as you mentioned, it's a highly competitive market because technologies are available and people are willing to pay to get these carbon accounting solutions. So we have hundreds of companies across the world working on carbon accounting solutions, helping customers, mainly mid-size and large-size companies, do carbon accounting. What has been my experience is that at Carbon Direct, we were really focused on getting the science part right. So ensuring that the science of carbon accounting, the measurement, the accuracy is high, because that's how we differentiated against other companies in the market. So instead of saying, here is a cool calculator of emissions, you can just put in your numbers and it'll give you a number. We said, no, we'll take you the data and we will analyze all this data on our own. And then we're going to prepare a footprint for you to understand why certain things were classified in different manner and how we calculate the emissions. So you have more visibility into the process and the traceability that you would expect for the carbon emissions for your company. What we were doing was, in a competitive market, we were sort of catching up with the number of features and the benefits that a customer expects. At the same time, we were also looking inside. Like we had a team of carbon accountants that were doing the work of carbon accounting using our platform. And what that meant was we could make their lives easy. We could improve the efficiency of that team so that we can generate these footprints more quickly. So instead of building every single feature that competition has, we thought we will do a two-pronged strategy where we would build some critical features, which would be table stakes, and we would then focus on improving our efficiencies so that we can increase the speed with which we offer our footprints to our customers. And as a result of that, we actually built some AI and ML products in our platform, but more focused towards our internal users, our carbon accounting team. That allowed us to improve their efficiency by 10-15% in a span of a couple of months. And as a result of that, we could get more footprints done more quickly and serve more customers on a monthly basis. So that's been my experience so far. If we just went out and built every single feature that competition has, then
Mhm.
it's just a me too product. And still there is more work to be done to figure out the differentiation and build that differentiation. But so far, our initial investments into AI and ML were really good.
Sure. I think there are two key points that I like to zoom in from here. The first thing you mentioned is in Carbon Direct, you focus on to be very scientific. Of course, it's very essential, but it also means there are solutions in the market that are less scientific. I guess that's probably the challenges we face with standardization. If I understood that correctly, what do you feel is the hardest part of accounting to standardize?
The hardest part, I would say, is scope three, measuring the scope three emissions of a company. Because going back to our previous example of taking two different companies, um, there is a guideline that's set by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that defines about 15 categories in scope three across which you can measure a company's emissions. Obviously, scope one, scope two is already there, but in terms of scope three, which accounts for 80% of companies' emissions, there are 15 categories. Those 15 categories have different interpretations for different types of industries that are trying to measure their emissions. And what that means is that in a company that has very big supply chain, depends on a lot of suppliers, and you have a supply chain which is very dynamic. You
Mhm.
would have suppliers coming in and out, and there would be complexities in the supply chain because you would have geopolitical risks, you would have some climate risks attached to those suppliers itself. That makes things extremely complex in terms of tracking and managing the data from those entities, which basically means the second point, which is having the data. So when you cannot have the data across all the key entities that you need to have, so data availability becomes a huge issue. And that's where I see a second challenge. Then, and this is also still within the scope three land. What I've also seen is different industries have carbon footprints based on factors like materials used, what kind of transportation was used, if they had a different energy source, gas versus electric versus renewable energy, stuff like that. Um, so that's another angle that I see as part of scope three. Then the fourth thing I think about is, as I mentioned briefly early on, the reporting standards, because there is a reporting standard in US, there's a reporting standard in EU, it's called CSRD. There is a new reporting standard called TCFD, and there is one more standard called ISSSB, and there is stuff happening in Asia as well. So these reporting standards are just, it's a great thing for the market in the sense that we are seeing more visibility and more attention is being paid. But for a company doing the carbon accounting for their scope three, or for a solution provider who's helping this company, it's quite a chaotic environment. And that's another thing I think of. Um, and I also mentioned a difference in emission factors early on, different standards and also different emission factors across different industries and different countries and different jurisdictions. So we have all of these. You combine all of these, it becomes a recipe for concern, recipe for chaos. And we need to solve this. And that basically means we need to have more transparency and collaboration across these structures, these framework organizations, these companies, these countries, solution providers. And that's where I think a lot of the work is being done now to improve the standardization of measuring scope three, because scope three is getting a lot of attention because it accounts for 80% plus emissions for a company. Scope one and
Mhm.
scope two are relatively easy because they are to some extent under your control, or you have a way to get the data for your scope 1, scope 2 quite easily as compared to scope 3. So scope 3 is the bucket that is going to be the focus in the next few years. And that's where a lot of standardization and innovation will happen.
Yeah, and what is pushing this development? The legislations coming out right now. What is the status in Europe, in US?
Yeah. Yeah. So two key things. One is that next year, 2025, is actually going to be a critical year for disclosures, which basically means that companies will have to now publicly report their emissions and under a regulation. It's not volunteer anymore because so far things have been completely voluntary. People
Mhm.
would report their emissions, companies would report their emissions on an annual basis, and they would report to companies, organizations like CDP, and then investors, regulatory bodies, government, insurance companies, customers would look at those reports from CDP for the company that they're looking at, and they would get the details they needed. But that's still voluntary. Starting next year, we would have EU's mandates coming in, which is going to affect about 5,000, 10,000 companies. And then in US, we have California state, which has already passed the law, and it's going to start having the companies with $1 billion in revenue and operating in California to start reporting their scope 1, scope 2. And then in a couple of years after that, start reporting on scope 3 as well. So
Mhm.
that is where we see regulation really coming in. And as a result of these two, I'm seeing more conversations happening across different US states and also in Asia, where everybody is looking into at least scope 1 and 2, but have a phased approach of having scope 3 also come in at about 2 to 3 years from now.
Right. So scope one and two are becoming mandatory in more and more countries and places, and scope three is upcoming. That's why
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
very
One more
hard.
thing I would mention
Mhm.
is that the number of companies that are targeted as a result of these mandates is not very large list of companies. However, as we introduce scope 3 in the mandate, these big companies will need to work with the suppliers to get the data for their scope 3.
Yeah.
And what that then means is that these suppliers, which tend to be smaller and mid-sized companies, they would need to do their scope 1, scope 2 to give that data to their big, large company customers. So this trickling effect will come into play where the mandate is for the large company, but they would need the data from their suppliers to actually get it done. So
Yeah.
ultimately, we will have a situation where these small, medium-sized companies, they will be required to do it, not because of a mandate that directly applies to them, but because of a situation that applies to their customers. And then these small, medium-sized companies will look for solutions. And we would need to have solutions that they can afford and they can implement fairly quickly. So that's where I
Yeah.
think the market is going to evolve faster.
Yeah, I do think that's a very interesting dynamic because if in the end the small suppliers for the big global companies fail to provide their scope one and two, then they automatically are disqualified as a supplier, and that's a
Yeah,
significant impact for their business.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Mhm. So that explained on the first part. And then the second part you also mentioned is about efficiency improvement. So
Mhm.
how long average that does it take for a company to do one round of carbon accounting?
It's not a good picture because companies on an annual basis, they spend about 3, 4 months just collecting data from all of their sources. And then they spend about a month or two to get the emissions calculated. This is not a worst case scenario. This is not a best case scenario either. It's like somewhere in the middle. Just recently, I was talking to somebody who was in the healthcare industry. When I say healthcare, I mean like more in the cosmetics industry. This person was responsible for doing the carbon emissions of that company. He basically told me that they spent 6 months just collecting the data. And it took them about total 9 to 10 months to do scope 1 and scope 2 only, which is absolutely unimaginable because you would imagine scope 1 and scope 2 to be easier to calculate and collect data for. Scope 3 is the hardest part. They didn't even touch scope 3 as part of that exercise. If you look at that, companies spend, if they spend like 2, 3 quarters every year just doing the calculation of a footprint, then they have lost the time to actually make a change in their business based on that footprint. Because the budget for a company, they generally decide on an annual basis for the entire year. Any kind of planning that happens is based on that budget. And if you are spending so much time on getting a carbon footprint number, then you're not actually building on the strategies for setting a target, for reducing those emissions, for buying and
Yeah.
offsetting the credits that would help you remove some of those emissions. So all of these things have an effect where if you're spending way too much time on the actual collection of data and getting a footprint, then you are compromising on what really matters, which is reduction of emissions, removal of emissions. And that's where I think a lot of efficiency play comes in, because you want to be able to get to that footprint number as quickly as possible. And the
Mhm.
challenge behind that is a lot of the solution providers come from academia. Like they have people who are in academia, and there is an emphasis on accuracy. And I feel like it has gone to a point where it's getting in the way of progress, because you want to actually have a good enough data point to act on. You will never have an extremely accurate number. After a point, working on accuracy and just doing that provides diminishing returns. So
Mhm.
you want to actually be able to take action based on a good enough information and then plan a strategy for getting reductions and removals done. That's where I
Yeah.
think a mindset shift has to happen. But that can only happen if you actually have solutions that provide you that kind of output at a very high speed and at a very good price. So I believe there is a market where we can go and get actionable insights with good enough data points and enable these companies to not spend this much time, these many months on just doing a footprint, because they just exhaust all the resources getting a footprint. For them, it becomes a checkbox that they check end of the year, but that is not going to help the world of
Mhm.
climate change.
Sure, I totally agree. And I think that's a nice philosophy to have in the space, right? Because we'll never reach perfection in terms of measurement. And then why do we measure? The end goal is really how to reduce and remove this carbon from the atmosphere. Totally echo on that. I think it's also very interesting related to your role as a PM in the space. You know, you need
Yeah.
to make very similar calls. What do we prioritize and what do customers need and what is our final goal, the impact we
Yeah.
want to make? Can you introduce some wins or failures that you would like to share with us as a PM in the space?
When I joined Carbon Direct, our focus was to um, really work on accuracy. We realized that the only way to scale for large number of companies is to rely more on software than human intelligence. We wanted to have a human in the loop system where the automation will take care of majority of the heavy lifting, and humans would be the ones reviewing the work and getting it finished. What we learned was that in the process of building these automated solutions, we reached a point where we were not able to improve accuracy further, at least in
Mhm.
that moment, because we had fewer data points to reliably build our models. And we had to switch gears to see how can we drive more impact and make the time it takes to do a footprint shorter. Automation was one of the hypotheses. It still is. It's a good hypothesis. We have actually made progress on it. But what happened as a result of some of those learnings was we went out and changed our roadmap to focus directly on the carbon accountants, people who are doing the review and finalizing a carbon footprint for a company. So instead of doing the entire part of their job through automation, we reached a point where we had an acceptable level of accuracy. And then we started building tools that would allow the review to happen in a quick manner. So instead of building on accuracy further, we built features that would allow a reviewer to come in and really go boom, boom, boom. I see this, done, check, done, check. So those kind of things were the things that we started doing as a result of that insight that we had from the automation and the adoption of that automated result. And
Mhm.
that led us to a point where we, in a span of a quarter, released a bunch of features focused on improving our internal efficiencies, which directly impacted the customer because we could get the footprints done more quickly for them and we could serve more customers. So that's how we went back and forth in terms of automation and improving the review process.
Sure. Is there any framework that was helpful in this process? Your ultimate goal is to reduce the time it takes to do
Yeah.
carbon accounting,
Yeah.
and then you identify the key areas. What has worked well for you?
Um, I think looking at different things. One is look at the market, like some of the competitives, what are they doing? How are they serving the customers? What business model are they in? How much are they charging? And what does the revenue model look like? And second thing is from a customer standpoint, what is the level of effort that they can put into this exercise of carbon accounting, both in terms of data collection and in terms of actually working with us to do the footprint, to understand the footprint, and then socialize that footprint within the company to make some changes in the business to reduce those emissions. So the frameworks have been mainly around customer discovery. And one of the things that we did really well was um, customer interviews. So we talked to a lot of customers, get their input on our thinking, get their understand their experience of doing the footprinting by themselves, because some customers actually done that. They use
Mm-hmm.
spreadsheets and other tools to do footprinting, and they have
Mm-hmm.
gone through the pain of doing it manually. So we wanted to focus on providing them a service that is done for them instead
Mm-hmm.
of having them work through the challenges again and again. And as part of that, um, when we did the customer interviews, we asked them a lot of questions around their day-to-day challenges, understanding what is driving the motivation behind a footprint, what do they expect to do once they get a footprint. So all of these kind of questions help them understand how to build a solution that would cater to those needs. And
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I would say is um, I'm a product manager, and obviously I am very deep into a lot of product management newsletters. And one of the newsletters that I really, really enjoy reading is from Lenny. He is an ex-product manager at Airbnb. And in one of his posts, newsletter posts, he talked about a mission, vision, strategy, and goals and roadmap kind of a document. So I took that to heart a lot. And I used that along with building a product charter document, which contained a bunch of these things. And then on the flip side, in terms of defining the metrics that you want to have for measuring the success of the products. So
Mm-hmm.
he also had published some of these things in his posts, and just very high quality content coming out from his world. And I, to some extent, follow him quite blindly at this point because I've seen the impact of the material that he's put out. So those are the kind of things that I have focused on, I've used, and I encourage everybody to look at some of these sources and see for yourself how to think, how to understand the customer, and then based on that, build products and measure the success of those products continuously.
Mm-hmm.
Keep an eye on the customers and just have the pulse of the customer always.
Yeah, customer first, customer centric mentality. And definitely a good shout out to Lenny's newsletter and podcasts for product data in general, entrepreneurship as well.
Yes.
So I want to dive into you being currently in the climate space because
Mhm.
you didn't start your career in the space. You had this
Yeah.
transition phase. Tell us more about it. Like what skills had helped you in this transitional period, and
Yeah.
what did you have moment of doubt? How did you overcome it?
Yeah. So my background is like the baseline of my background is data analytics. I did my graduate degree in computer science with a focus in machine learning. And so data has always been my thing. Even as a high school kid, I would ace through the data problems and data courses easily, no issues. So that has been my pillar across all like 15, 20 years. And in my in my career, I worked in a very small company early on as employee number one, which was around sustainability to some extent, like measuring the flow of water and helping people understand how much they're consuming and how they can conserve all those things. So that's where I learned about the craft of product management, and I really loved it. So I also loved being in a very small company. So those three things, data, product, and startups, has been my expertise, has been my go-to comfort zone, because I just really enjoy the intersection of
Mhm.
these three things. And I believe as I progress in my career, I have carried these three things in a very, very meticulous way. And what that means is that I'm able to combine the experiences of being a data expert, being a product manager, working with large companies as customers, and working in small companies, the startups. And all of those things combined led me to a point where I could go and target climate companies and really build solutions for the climate companies. So that's how I landed in
Mhm.
the climate world, because these three things were the ingredients for me to go and uh, pitch myself.
Mhm. Awesome. And was it an easy transition? Did you have challenges, moments of doubt?
Yeah, it was not easy. I mean, I've had situations where I was trying to change my role from being in sales engineering, pre-sales, post-sales engineering to being in product. That was a very big transition for me.
Mm.
And then the second one was around getting into climate. So I always wanted to be in the climate space, and I actually posted on LinkedIn some time back how my journey has been. And this is like 10 years ago. I decided that I want to be in the climate space, but it was not easy at all because at that point, climate was really focused on academia, people who had degrees in chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, and just like real hard sciences. And
Mhm.
I didn't have that. I was a pure computer science person with a software background. And it was very difficult to find an intersection of product and sustainability. So I just kept at it. And I think 2017 was the year where things turned around for me in terms of going into product roles. And then taking that beyond, focusing really hard on the climate space and finding opportunities in there through communities and through courses, meeting people, and just the evolution of the industry itself to be acceptable to the software folks. All those things came together around the same time. That is how it happened.
Okay, a long preparing process and some
Yeah.
occasions came up. You mentioned there are resources and communities that help you with the transition. Can you give us some recommendations?
Yeah. As I was learning about things, I mostly was focused on reading books and taking courses and just meeting people. Obviously, trying to apply to any kind of climate job that would suit my profile.
Mhm.
But then I think 2021, during COVID, things changed materially in terms of the adoption of non-technical folks or non-academia folks in the climate space. Because I started seeing these websites. One of the examples I can share is Climate Tech Careers. It's just go to that website. It has all the
Mhm.
resources that you can need to get started. For somebody who has no experience working in climate, but they're coming from,
Mhm.
let's say, a pure tech, pure software world, just go there. You would see so many resources in terms of courses that you should take, podcasts you can listen to, job boards. If you want to start a company, then they have a sister website. It's called climatefounder.org. And that's where you can find a lot of resources for startup founders in the climate space. Excellent resources. Um,
Mhm.
the other thing that I would share is when people are trying to get into climate space, like I did, I had very strong filters to say, I want to work in the energy sector. I want to work in the food waste. And as I was taking the Terra.do course, it's a climate action course from this company called Terra.do. As I was
Mhm.
taking that course, the director of education was a guest speaker in our cohort. And one of the things he mentioned was, if you really want to work in climate, see if you have some skills that directly apply to a problem in climate. Doesn't have to be the same sector in the climate that you are interested in, but see if
Mhm.
there is a sector, there is a problem within the climate space to which you can apply your skills today and not have to prepare more to work on the space that you are deeply interested in. Because that way you can get in the space more quickly. So
Mhm.
basically, in other words, loosen your filters a little bit. That's what I did. And that's how I found out about carbon direct, carbon accounting. And that's how I
Mhm.
landed in the carbon accounting world. And that's why we are having this conversation. Otherwise,
Yeah.
if I had stuck with my strong filters, I don't know, there would have been an alternate reality. But I'm glad I took that decision to reduce some of my filters.
Yeah, I think as climate tech space is evolving, it needs talent coming from all sorts of background. So
Yes.
really leveraging your background in the process is super helpful. And it's interesting you mentioned removing your filters, whereas a lot of people go into climate say, oh, I can work for whatever industry and topic that's relevant. Then at that stage, actually the advice for them usually is to have a more specific focus so they can develop their skill and the understanding of the industry further. So on the tool side of the spectrum, I
Yeah,
would
yeah, totally. I
say,
mean, that's a
yeah,
completely valid advice. But then, do you actually have the skills and expertise to serve that particular niche in the climate? Is the question. If you do not,
yeah,
then consider being a little more flexible.
yeah, for sure. All right, Prakhar, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience that we haven't mentioned yet?
No, I think the one thing I would say is that you asked about my journey into climate a little bit, right? The one thing I want to share with people who are looking at this is have some of your strong suits, strong pillars in your journey. One of those should be that if you really are interested in climate, or for that matter, any particular endeavor in your life,
Mhm.
just really go hard after it. Like if you really want it, go and get it. Work hard and get it. Because in my journey, I had a lot of discouraging feedback, both in terms of getting into product roles and getting into then sustainability roles. And what I did was I just didn't give up on getting into product roles because I was rejected so many times and I had never been rejected so much. So that gave me the confidence when in future I was looking into getting into climate.
Mhm.
Being rejected, getting into product gave me the confidence to just keep going for climate. And that
Yeah,
kind of built a lot of resiliency in me. And
yeah,
in future, I have a desire of building my own startup. And I believe that having gone through those exercises and those experiences of rejection and keep trying would be would serve me better. Because ultimately, what I don't want to do is look back in 30 years from now and say, I wish I had done that. And I don't
mm,
want to be in that situation of wishing I had done that. So I just operate
yeah,
from a standpoint of having no regrets. So if you really want something, go and work hard. At the very least, you'll learn. Best case scenario, you will get it, but you will be happier. At least you tried. So there will be no regrets. And that's where
yeah.
you should think about regret minimization framework.
I love it. I think people in this transition and currently facing a lot of frustration, discouragement, and failure need to hear this. So thanks for sharing.
Of
So
course,
with
yeah.
that, let's go into our lightning round. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. First question is about what is one data tool or source that you find very important in your work?
Um, in my last company, I mean, I've been data all along, and I've used a lot of data analytics tools, visualization, and data warehousing, like all of the stuff. One tool that I really, really enjoyed using was Sigma from this company called Sigma Computing. And I'm going to say it's the best tool in the market because
Okay.
I have used things like Tableau, Looker, and a bunch of others. Everybody has their strong opinions. My strongest opinion is that Sigma is a very, very important player in this market because it's just done so well. It's cloud first, highly
Mhm.
flexible. It can handle large amount of data without any issues.
Mhm.
And I went from having an idea to having a beautiful chart, an easy to explain chart in a matter of minutes. And I could work and collaborate with other people on those things. I could build dashboards and all the fun things with a large amount of data that's powering those reports. And recently they've introduced obviously AI technology in their stack.
Mhm.
And now it's even more fun because I can just say I want this and it would generate the SQL queries and it will generate the charts and everything without any input from me. And on the flip side, it has a very, very clean interface for data lineage. So you can understand all of your sources that are being used for a report, how they were transformed each step, how they were joined, and you could see that lineage very, very clearly. That has always
Mhm.
been a problem for any kind of data analytics tool because it never existed at all. So you always had to have some sort of a data dictionary, which would be separate from the tool itself. But that tool
Mhm.
includes that. And that I think is a very big game changer. So yeah, check
Interesting.
it out.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, but sounds really promising. We'll have a look.
Yeah.
Second one, on the book recommendation, what is one book that have greatly influenced you in your life, in your work?
Um, I read a lot and I've read a lot of books. Um, I think the one that really comes to my mind is from the former US Vice President Al Gore. It's called An Inconvenient Truth. This is obviously focused more around the climate and sustainability issues, the climate change part.
Mhm.
But I first saw the documentary of that book in a theater, and I was weeping. Then I read the book, and it gave me the it gave me my life's purpose, basically.
Mm.
So that's how transformative it was for me. And ever since then, he has published a few more books as sequels. Go check it out. Read it. You will not regret it.
Yeah, I agree. I go on that. The third question, what do you see as the biggest opportunity in using data for climate impact?
Yeah. I believe so. We see these seasons of hurricanes and tornadoes across the world.
Mm.
Um, Flash floods as a result of that. Cities and rural parts of the world getting completely destroyed. What people do not understand right now, at least the common person doesn't understand right now, is how it is in relation to climate change. Because they just see the event happening, they don't understand the reasons behind it or
Mm.
what led to it and what, if anything, can be done about it. So I think data has a big role to play in terms of telling that story of how this is happening and why.
Mhm.
Because I think the data exists for telling this story, but it's so scientific that it's not easy to understand. So it's really important for people with these data skills and the communication skills to
Mm.
provide the story for people to understand why certain things are happening. how an event like this is magnified in terms of intensity, and why do we have this high frequency of these many events per year now than it used to be 50 years ago, for example.
Mhm.
The second part is adaptation. Because of all of these events, what can we do to help people in these risky areas adapt to these events or find other places where they can go and live? Um, Food security is a big issue. So all these climate
Mhm.
events lead to situations where you have farms and farmers struggling to grow their crops. And as a result of that, the companies buying those crops from them have have a lower supply. And as a result, consumers like you and I, and even like less privileged people, they have access to less food. So that
Mhm.
creates a food insecurity. So we have to use data to identify these challenges early on and be able to build adaptation plans early on. So that's where I
Yeah.
think data has a huge role to play as well.
Yeah. And I think for the second point on adaptation, also data storytelling is very needed here. How
Yeah,
to quantify and give the message out from a scientific and academic research field to intrigue people's and organizations and governments' actions.
yeah.
Totally agree on that. Yeah. Next question is your important message to convey. If you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere in the world with anything on it, what would you write on it?
Yeah, I think I just go back to the point I mentioned earlier, which is choose what you want and just go hard after it so that you have one less regret in life. You don't want to be an old person looking back at your life and thinking, oh, I could have done that if I just had more courage. And I
Yeah.
think the challenge is that people just feel like, what if I fail? And I think the recipe for addressing that is to actually fail a lot. And if you fail a lot, you sort of get used to it. And you see
Hmm.
the failure not as just complete down and about kind of thing. You see failure as a building block towards your success. That's exactly
Yeah.
what happened to me. And I mean, I was rejected so many times for different jobs when trying to change my career. So yeah, just focus on failing a whole lot.
Right. Thanks for the motivation and inspiration. I think connecting very smooth with that is our last question. Do you have
Mhm.
a favorite failure of yours?
Yeah. I can, yeah, I can talk about the some of the transitions in my career. So 7 years. So I have been doing product for 7 years now. And before that, I was in non-product roles like pre-sales engineering, professional services kind of roles. When I was trying to transition into product management, because my first job was an early stage employee doing a lot of things where I learned about product management. Some of my peers became product managers at that time. This is 2011, 2012. So when I was looking into doing this myself, um, I interviewed a whole lot from like small companies to large companies, hundreds of interviews, which basically meant I must have applied to like 1,000 companies. And basically every product position I could think of, I could see, I applied to it. Obviously, that's not a very great strategy because I didn't have at that point any other strategy. I didn't have a connection. I didn't have a network. Um, but I was pretty clear about getting into product. And it was extremely hard because I had no direct product experience. And at that time, people were really hiring experienced PMs or people with at least 1 year or 2 years of experience in product roles. So um, I was so adamant that I turned down a big promotion at that company where I was not a product role. Um, and within the company, around my family, friends, since I was getting so much rejection, they started asking me if this is still the right thing for me, and maybe I should consider doing something else or just keep doing what I was doing. So this constant stream of rejection was not encouraging either. And as I mentioned, I had never faced this level of rejection in my life before. Um, what happened was I found something on LinkedIn, and that was that position required strong data skills. So it was about building data products as a PM, a person who could understand deep data analytics really well. And that fit my profile because until that point, I was basically trying for anything in product roles. But as soon as I saw that, the intersection of data and product, that's how I realized, okay, I need to really focus on my data part and see if I can target data-oriented product roles. I really went after it. Like I said, if you want something, go after it. So I really went after that process of interview with that company, didn't leave anything unturned, and finally got a job, which required me to actually move cities. So I had to move from San Francisco Bay Area to Seattle, which is where I am right now. And it's been great because I learned a whole lot in the process of finding a role. Once I found the role, in this first few months, I was so overwhelmed because being in a product role is extremely challenging. And it was a very large company. So being in a very large company in a new product role as a new PM, it's a combination of things that can lead to a disaster. So I was very close to quitting in the first few months, but I decided to stay and work on some of my weaknesses, some of my blind spots. And I stayed there for 3 years, building products in the automotive industry around autonomous driving. So that was a lot of fun. That directly led me to carbon accounting. And the reason for that is I built data products. Carbon accounting is a very data heavy industry. And I've been building carbon accounting products as software products. So there was a direct correlation between me doing that first PM job in a data land and landing into the carbon accounting world and therefore the climate world. So that's how things materialized. And I just did not give up on finding that initial role and staying in that role for 3 years to learn everything that there was to learn. And beyond that, I mean, similar experiences getting into climate, similar struggles, similar amount of rejection. But this time, I was more stoic about it. I was less concerned about not getting through because I had a lot of close encounters, even got an offer, had a lot of false starts, one step forward, two steps back kind of situation. But stuff happens. I just relied on my gut that you can do this because you have done this before. So that's how I think about things. And again, coming back to the point of failure, just keep failing. Fail so much that you just get used to it and you get something out of it so that in the future, you're not afraid of it.
Love it. It's like the book Failing Your Way to Success or Failing My Way to Success. And
Oh, I haven't read
thank you
that.
so much.
I will pick it up. Yeah, I haven't read that yet.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your determination and resilience. Definitely, you illustrated super well through more than 100 of interviews, and now seeing where you are now, sitting in this intersection between data product and the sustainability. So definitely a good example for people to learn and to embrace the process. Thank you so much, Prakhar, for sharing all your story very honestly and openly with us, and also taking us through a really nice tour and introduction of carbon accounting.
Thank you so much for having me here, Tammy. And people can reach out to me on LinkedIn if they need to.
Awesome.